This week, we discuss Polar Edge Raspberry Pis being used in a bank heist. Has F5 really contained the breach? Two-faced malware, authentication bypass on a storage manager, and zero disco. Stay tuned. Below the surface, coming up next. Welcome to Below the Surface. It's episode number 63, being recorded on Wednesday, October 29th, 2025. I'm your host, Paul Asadoorian, joined by Mr. Chase Snyder. Chase, welcome.
What's up, Paul? Good to be here.
Oh, I see we're both wearing my microphone's in the way. We're both wearing Eclipsium branded gear today,
Got to rep
almost
the
as if
things you
we
love,
planned it.
right?
Right? Almost as if we planned it. Which is great. We got a packed show for you. Before we get started, Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you'll find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo. All that at eclipsium.com/go. We've got some good news stories to talk about this week. I took some liberties to add some stories there based on stuff that I've been observing. And Chase, you had the Raspberry Pi one. We can start there. You said you're like, this is older. I'm like, oh, it doesn't mean we can't talk about it.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, okay. I was excited about that one. I was looking into just cyber attacks on banks. No reason, just curious.
Mm.
There was the thing relatively recently where Iran's state bank got targeted by Israel. I think it was like hacktivists. Um, and then Jay Powell, the chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, said, basically, watch out, we're a target too. If you're a bank or the Fed or major financial services institution, you are potentially a target in like the global geopolitical conflicts that are heating up. It's like, okay, have there been any cyber attacks on banks? And he came up with this one that was like straight out of a hacker movie, right? They literally made a Raspberry Pi that had, I think, the tiny shell backdoor like installed on it and
Mm-hmm.
plugged it in um, into what sounded vaguely like an ATM server, like some sort of ATM management device, not actually an ATM, right? Not an individual ATM
Oh, see,
machine.
I thought it was an individual ATM machine.
I think it was a switch. Now I'm going to go back and dig and just double check.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I think they had to like sneak it into the actual
Like the almost
data
not the data
center,
center, but
but
or
yeah.
the network closet or whatever at the bank.
Yeah,
Yeah, it had a
exactly. I
switch on it. I gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, because imagine if you could plug a Raspberry Pi with like some
Mm-hmm.
widely available open source hacker software on it and just plug it into the ATM itself. Every single time I have to hold myself back from saying ATM machine.
Yes.
M stands for machine.
It's
My
true.
ATM machine PIN number. But yeah, so it's like, yeah, you wrote it down great in this little note where it's like this intersection of hardware based and sort of skullduggery, like physically sneaking in and plugging in this device, but then exploiting network access and putting in a kernel rootkit on a separate machine inside the environment that the defenders then had a really hard time getting this attacker out of there. And so they like wormed their way in, not wormed, I shouldn't use that because that means something specific that's different,
Mm.
but they squirreled their way into the environment through this Raspberry Pi that they plugged in and made it onto an Oracle Solaris machine with this rootkit that they
Wow.
then had a really hard time, kicking the bad guys out of there, even though, they say that they stopped the attack before it succeeded in its ultimate goal of, stealing customer information or money or whatever they're going
I
after.
guess people still use Solaris. Interesting.
I'm going to look up right now what an ATM switch is. I should have done this.
Mm. My
Should have
guess
done
is
this.
it's just a network switch that the ATM
Yeah,
is plugged
that
into,
controls
right?
the ATMs. Yeah,
Because most ATMs are just the operating system is like you see them, they run Windows, right? Embedded Windows
yeah.
under the
Yeah, you'll
covers.
sometimes see the like boot screen or the like blue BIOS
Yeah.
screen, safe mode screen or whatever on it in public, which is very funny and annoying.
And also, I think cool that, well, not cool, but bad, but also cool that attackers are using Raspberry Pis. I'm surprised actually, but I was looking at the story. I was surprised we haven't seen more of attackers using Raspberry Pi devices to backdoor networks. Of course, your options are vast, but a lot of capabilities in a small little computer. Surprised it hasn't been weaponized more by actual threat actors. I know pen test teams do use them as well, but we used to really nerd out on what we call drop boxes, right? If you get physical access and you go into the bathroom and you crawl up in the ceiling and you find the switch and you can plug something into it. I think
It's
it's
just more
actual.
cinematic.
Yeah, yeah. And like what would that device be and what would it run, right? And we do all kinds of stuff on it now. So
Sure. Yeah. It's always really funny when like hacker movies, like it's way cooler to watch someone crawling through the ducts and plugging into something versus
right.
sitting there and typing miscellaneous like green text on a black background in a terminal that always later gets revealed to just be like some HTML that they were typing. Like
Yeah,
number
they're
of
just
hacker movies where it's just like,
right.
oh, they went
Just
inspect
catting out,
element
yeah.
on a browser and that's what they
They're
showed.
just catting out HTML files or style sheets and letting it scroll on the screen because it looks cool.
Yeah, I'm reading about ATM switching systems right now, and yeah, it seems like it's a separate kind of hardware,
Interesting. That's
whole
interesting.
separate system. But ultimately, yeah, I don't know whether it got plugged into the ATM or the switch itself. But I don't know. Thinking about cyber attacks on banks and financial institutions, both just from a perspective of that's where the money is, right? Why do bank
Mm-hmm.
robbers rob the bank? Because that's where the money is. Why do hackers hack the banks? Because that's where the money is. But also as this sort of bastion of geopolitical stability, it's like you can really create social uncertainty by demonstrating that the banks are vulnerable. And they
Right.
obviously invest heavily in cybersecurity, especially the big ones. There's literally, I think, 8 banks in the US, maybe 10 globally, that are identified as systemically important financial institutions, or, too big, colloquially, too big to fail.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, if those are obviously getting cyber attacked all the time, you don't hear about it that much, and maybe that's because they're doing a really good job of defending it. But I think recently there's been more of disclosure rules coming out where it's like if and when they experience a cyber incident or a data breach, there's a certain amount of time to disclose it and remediate it. And I think that timeline has gotten shorter within the last like couple of years. There's like more and more regulation about it that I would guess is driving more investment into both prevention and rapid incident response around it. But I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. I don't have a whole lot more to say about it other than that I thought it was an interesting example because of this sort of intersection of hardware and software and the rootkit and the sort of lateral movement from that hardware plugin starting point, the Dropbox, as you say. And
Yeah,
I'm
and we used to
curious.
spend a lot of time trying to figure out ways to identify new devices that come up on the network. If it
Mhm.
was in fact plugged into the network, right? Conceivably, it could have been something else that maybe didn't touch their network, or maybe it did. But if it does, identifying those new devices, there was a lot of things that we went through to discover those, mostly like recommendations for customers where we walked in, I walk into a conference room, I go under the table or in the corner and I plug something into a network jack, and then I walk out. And a lot of organizations, in particular one that I did a pen test on, and there were several, but this one, right, there was a conference room that you could go into that you didn't have to go through security to get to the conference room. And so, you make up some kind of ruse as to why you need to be in the conference room, or, while you're waiting for someone or whatever, you go in there and you plug this thing into the jack. And it was like, well, how do we detect that? Right. We should detect new devices being plugged in, but devices come and go on a network all the time. So, like, what do we do specifically to detect and or prevent that access without inconveniencing legitimate users that are like, oh, I need to plug in my laptop or some other device that is legitimate, and then they can't because you've disabled the port. It's like, so how do you balance usability and security in that environment? ATMs are different environment, right? Lockdown, there shouldn't be any new devices that are coming up on those networks unless you know about them. So
Yeah.
Interesting.
Ironic too, because putting a trying to discover new devices that are getting plugged in. It's like, okay, inventory, found asset inventory, foundational requirement for all cybersecurity, right? And most organizations don't really have it. There's already just tons of stuff plugged in that they do not know about. It's not inventory, it's not being monitored. So it's like
Right.
detecting new stuff. It's like, why don't we detect the like 20% of everything that's already plugged in that we just do not have cataloged anywhere?
Yeah. Let's go to F5.
Yeah, okay. We can do the whole show on that.
It's because yeah, this article was amazing. I'll make sure it gets in the show notes. It's kind of a knock on F5. This is just kind of a warning, and it does express itself as an opinion piece. However, they did dissect the earnings report. Was it an earnings report or an
Yeah,
investor call? It was an
earnings call,
earnings.
yeah.
Yeah, and I'm also told that earnings call didn't go very well. Like they haven't been meeting their earnings, and they haven't met their earnings, and they lowered the investor expectations, or what do you call that?
The
Like rep
guidance.
revenue, yeah, revenue targets, guide, whatever the stock market language is, right? So it's not looking good for F5 from a financial perspective. Some analysts that I've spoken to, mostly self-servingly, because I'm like, so is this like a buy? Like Chase Cunningham wrote the book, I think it's called Buying the Breach,
By the
right?
breach, yeah.
Buy the Breach. And I was like, so is this an example of that? And at least one industry expert I talked to was like, well, no, because they're not meeting their earnings. So there's speculation, or at least a path that this could go down is that F5 it becomes a private company, not a public company, because they haven't met their earnings and their stock price has suffered as a result of this breach. But I think there's other reasons why that stock price has dipped in this case, not just as a result of the breach.
Yeah, there was famously, and I think Chase Cunningham's book came out after this one, maybe, but CrowdStrike's stock dipped pretty badly when they had the blue screen of death incident that happened
Right.
last year or 2 years ago, whenever it was. That, yeah, caused a bunch of challenges, but ultimately CrowdStrike was in a really strong position, even though, that was a huge slip up, right?
It
But
was.
as a company, they were kind of crushing it. And there was one anecdote that came out in the reporting of that I thought was super funny, which is that a big investment firm issued a white paper about it that was like, buy more CrowdStrike right now. This is a blue chip stock. They're doing
Yeah.
great. It's essentially on sale right now because of this. But they couldn't transmit that white paper out to their investment desks or whatever because of the CrowdStrike outage.
Oh,
They were like sending out the buy CrowdStrike message, but the
yeah.
computers were down because of CrowdStrike. Who knows if
Right.
that's true? But it was a funny anecdote. It seemed believable to me at the
Well, then,
time.
AWS was like, hold my beer.
Yes.
So there's
I'm
that.
generally a believer in buy the dip, not financial advice. But F5, yeah, it's different. We were talking about this because, there's been breaches at other big IT providers.
Mm,
And to me, I mean, okay, not all of them have resulted in a CISA emergency directive, which this one did. And it was
right.
called out in this Deep Spectre research article that you mentioned that usually when there's a breach at a big IT provider, it does not result in a CISA emergency directive. There have been CISA emergency
Right.
directives recently that were about, big products like Cisco ASA. There was a CISA ED
Yeah.
about that because there was a known exploited in the wild vulnerability. This one is different. It's not, there's no known exploited in the wild vulnerabilities. There were vulnerabilities
Right.
disclosed. F5 said we had these vulnerabilities that we were working on, which, yeah, organizations have that. Not
Yeah.
weird for
Right.
them to have undisclosed vulnerabilities that they're trying to patch before they disclose it. Totally fine.
Hmm.
But there's like these got disclosed and then they patched them. So it's like there's no known attacks on anybody other than F5, but CISA put out an emergency directive, and that sort of levels up the scope, or like it makes
Hmm.
it seem different and like a bigger deal than the other breaches at sort of big global IT infrastructure providers that like don't even really make the news.
It's interesting too. The article was talking about IOActive and NCC Group, who are amazing companies that do amazing security research. If I remember correctly, IOActive is pretty heavy on the product security, at least That's my understanding. People can correct me if I'm wrong. But they focus more on the security of a product, right? Like I don't have any inside knowledge, but let's just say you're an automobile manufacturer and you want a security team to come evaluate how you're implementing security or not in your automobiles. IO Active would do that kind of work. NCC Group I follow very closely for their security research that they publish. And F5 used them to do the investigation to determine the depth and scope of the breach in the context of, is our supply chain been compromised, basically, for how we produce software and for our devices. And that came under scrutiny in this article, which I think is interesting, as it not being quite a fit. I don't know if that's not necessarily true or not, but certainly I think everyone's in the back of everyone's mind is, attackers were in there for a year. What did they really do? A
Yeah.
year's a long time. Like so when I read that in this article, I started thinking about it more, and I was like, well, like you're in there for a year. Like, what if you did stuff and then covered your tracks, and then like by the time someone comes to do the analysis, the attackers did stuff 6 months ago. How would you ever find that, right? Like logs rotate the whole thing. So that was one of the things from this article that it got me thinking about. I don't know what your feelings are, Chase, but
Yeah. Something that they called out specifically in the article, they mentioned something that had been said in the F5 earnings call. F5 earnings transcript of that call is public, so you can find it
right,
on
because it's a
Yahoo
public
Finance.
company.
They link to it in the footnotes. And the question from someone who was identified as like a manager of IT infrastructure or something like that was that there had been a statement that the breach equally affected software and hardware. So it was not just virtual editions, but that the breach was equally impactful to software and hardware.
Hmm.
And apparently, the person who had asked about that um, was not sure about that. Okay, yeah. So the person who asked it was uh, I won't read their name out loud, but you can go read it if you want. But their
Hmm.
title was Managing Director of Data Infrastructure. And they said, just maybe you could clarify, because you've got big IP as the appliance system business, but you have the virtual editions of big IP. So when you talked about the breach, you said it affected big IP. Does that mean that the breach affects both software and hardware equally? And then the CEO of F5 said, yes, it does.
Well, yeah,
So
because it's basically the same software that you put in a virtual appliance versus on actual hardware, is how I would interpret that.
yeah, sure. Yeah, that's totally fair. Um, but so anyway, the earnings transcript is really interesting. But yeah, that question of what does an advanced threat actor, claimed nation state attacker,
Hmm.
there's been speculation about which one it is, but it has not been formally
Hmm.
attributed by F5 or anyone else, as far as I know. There's just been sort of breadcrumbs connecting it to this Brickstorm backdoor that's has been connected to a specific threat actor in prior Mandiant research. And so there's scuttlebutt, right, about who it is. But yeah, if you're an advanced threat actor, you're in there for a year, and what comes out at the end of it is like, oh, there was 44 vulnerabilities, but we don't know if they got breached. And also there's nothing else going on inside of here that we know of that's all that bad. So we patched the vulnerabilities, and I can see why people would be asking the question.
Hmm.
And we know, because we have customers that are also customers of F5 that are asking questions about what they need to do to stay confident going forward that their systems are not exposed or protected against those exposures.
Right. And I think it's interesting too when we and I don't know if this came up in the earnings call, but the threat actor stole source code.
Right.
Now, if I didn't say all source code, so are they obligated to disclose, like, okay, but which and how much of which software source code was stolen, or do they not know? but they just know it wasn't all. But that's somewhat like ambiguous. Like, oh, we wrote some source code and it was off in a different repository for some utility or something. We know they didn't gain access to that, but they got everything else. Like, what is? Oh, I'm just making stuff up, but like, what does that really mean?
Mhm.
What did they take? What can they definitively prove that was leaked as part of their source code? Would help us and the customers to understand the depth and scope in what we might want to do. If it was just like a software for one application, that would have been nice to know, right? I don't know. I don't think there's anything in there about that, but
Yeah, I'll be interested to see. I think we haven't seen the end of it. Like,
yeah.
it would be very surprising to me if there was not another news cycle, at least, about the incident and about the impact on both the customers and on F5 as a business, whether it's about some further incident that happens or just a further disclosure, more information about things that had happened in the past. Um, I don't, I don't think it's over.
No, I agree. Um, they are distributing CrowdStrike's EDR product on F5 appliances. Is that true? We've confirmed that, right?
Yeah, which really unusual. That came up in the earnings call too. And they talk about something that we talk about all the time, right,
Mm-hmm.
Paul? That
Mm-hmm.
network
It's a good
companies that
thing.
make network
Yeah.
appliances historically don't let you put an EDR on there, even though it's Linux under the covers and EDR agents, to varying degrees of success and efficacy, EDR agents can work on Linux systems. And I think F5 Big IP is CentOS,
Yeah, I think
under
so.
flavor of Linux under the covers. All the major network boxes are. This is something I learned from you,
Mm-hmm.
that all the major network boxes are Linux under. It's Linux all the way down. And but this is the first one that has allowed, and it's relatively limited as far as what I've seen in the documentation about it, is that there's only certain versions. It can only go, I think, on the virtual edition, um,
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
and it's limited to certain versions. That is not all encompassing. I should double check myself on this, but I'm pretty sure it's not even all of the versions that were affected by the vulnerabilities that were
Yep.
disclosed as part of
I
the
have a
breach.
theory. I have a theory as to why, but
Okay. I'm
when
curious
you
about the theory. Can you
well
say
when
it
you
out loud on the pod?
yeah, because when you support Linux, because like we support Linux, right?
Sure.
And different Linux distributions will use different kernel versions. And if your defensive software, if you will, has to support that Linux kernel version in the
Yep.
context of like a Linux kernel driver, that means you have to compile your code against that kernel
Mhm.
version. And my guess is that CrowdStrike out of the gate probably had agents for this specific kernel version. And if I was like, all right, we're running that kernel version on these systems, but not those, and so therefore support is limited, would be my
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah,
Be my
totally.
guess.
All right. I pulled up the F5 document, getting started with Falcon Sensor for Big IP,
Mm.
updated October 22nd. So that's a week ago as of today. And it says, okay, it's an early access program of Falcon Sensor for Big IP, right? And it's for Big IP Virtual Edition 17.1.3 and 17.5.1.3 environments. And it's got this bullet in there under an important information header that says the EAP Falcon Sensor, or EAP meaning Early Access Program,
Hmm.
Falcon Sensor has been tested by CrowdStrike and F5 using a very specific configuration that balances visibility and detection while preserving system availability and performance. As such, you must use the exact configuration described in this document. Using any
Interesting.
other configuration is not supported and strongly discouraged. So there's some
Wow.
hedging language in there. It's still
Strongly
credit.
discouraged. Strongly discouraged.
You only use as written on the label, as recommended on the label. Still
Mm.
credit to them, because no other network device company so far has put it let it you
Right.
put an endpoint agent on there. So it is big, and hopefully, honestly, this creates a sea change in the industry where it's like, okay, yeah, we let you monitor under the covers of these network devices because it's been
Mm-hmm.
We talk about all the time. I cite this at every opportunity. The Verizon DBIR report showed a 8x increase in exploitation of vulnerabilities against network edge devices like VPNs and firewalls and routers and switches and such. It's like it is the new battlefront, the network
Right.
devices, and to not have such a well established sort of defensive tool available as EDR for those kinds of devices uh, really hamstrings defenders.
Yeah, and some are going to say, well, there's EDR bypasses, and if the EDR detects something, someone in the IT security team has to notice it and pay attention to it, and therefore, like, why bother, right? You kind of get some of those objections.
Hmm.
I think it's good. I think if you're doing something, as long as you're balancing costs, right? Put that aside for a moment. But if you're doing something to make an attacker's life more miserable and increasing the work that they have to do, that's a good thing, right? And also, you're increasing visibility while they may have a bypass for it. Maybe at some juncture, this happens on Windows systems, the attacker does something that does get caught by an EDR eventually. Now, it might be too late, but at least you've got an indicator or some kind of warning.
Yeah.
Whereas without EDR, you have none of that. You're completely blind. So I guess the insights that EDR provides is a good thing, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. 100%. And it's like, lockpicks exist, but you don't use that as an excuse not to lock stuff.
Great analogy. Great analogy. Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah.
So
One really,
I do hope this is a trend. I like it, and I hope it's more than just CrowdStrike. There's some competition in the market, right? I know our product does some pretty deep forensics, if you will, on these devices as well, which is different from EDR. EDR is more about detecting behaviors. We're more about detecting integrity failures and threats in the actual binaries that are on the system. So there's some great things happening to help you protect your devices, and I hope people start adopting this, right? Whatever it is, you can't. I think what we're coming down to, Chase, is you can't just drop the Pulp Fiction briefcase in your network and not do anything else in terms of monitoring. That we need to monitor it like everything else, like Windows systems, like Linux
yeah,
systems, like
got to
Mac
look
OS
inside.
systems. Yep. So, anything else on F5?
uh, Yeah, I don't know. I'll be curious which industries end up being the most like proactive or impacted. Like I feel like there's likely going to be stuff, any big security threat report comes out, there's an industry teardown of like, manufacturing is like the most targeted industry by cyber attackers. But the cost of a breach is the highest for banks and financial services. There's all these reports that I love to read that come out every year. And I'll be really curious how this affects them. There's always one or two big things. This is on my mind because we're coming up to the end of the year. There's always one or two big things that really skew those reports. Like a couple of years ago, it was the Move It, the file transfer thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it just hit everybody, and
It did.
it changed the shape of every line graph and bar chart and histogram in those reports because it was
I
so
heard from I think another
widespread.
podcast that the attackers compromised so many different organizations with the Move It breach that they were overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Yeah.
It's like success problem. Oh no. It's like
Yeah.
I'm drowning in the money hose. The money
Right.
fire hose is literally knocking me over.
Yeah. It's nuts. Um, did you happen to read the about the Polar Edge backdoor?
No, I didn't, but I read the show notes about it. So we're doing it
Yeah. So
live.
this comes from Sequoia, I believe,
Ooh, yeah,
whose
okay.
research we've covered before, right? They wrote
Yeah,
up
they do good work.
they do great work, right? And a lot of times it is malware analysis and vulnerability analysis specific to IoT devices, if you will, or network edge enterprise gear. They did some work on Cisco. What was the campaign they uncovered on Cisco called? They came from the same group. I think it's an Israeli company. They publish
Hmm.
great work. I can't remember the name, but anyway, Polar Edge is malware that runs on Linux that's targeting QNAP NAS devices. and they named this the Polar Edge backdoor. So they revealed manipulation of authentication flows, persistent strategies, and network evasion tactics. All things I'm seeing once attackers gain a foothold on these Linux-based devices, and it is interesting to me. Well, we have this discussion: do enterprises run things like QNAP storage devices? And we don't know the answer to all that, right? I know in the federal government the SysAkev list will get updated for things that are seemingly consumer-based IoT devices, but as we've seen, these devices trickle into your enterprise. But primarily, I think the QNAP NAS is a consumer product. Is that your take on it too, Chase?
Yeah, it doesn't seem super enterprise or industrial. Vicious Trap was the other thing that we talked about
Yep.
that
Yep.
Sequoia had covered. But yeah, they're doing good work. Someone from Sequoia should come on the pod.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
but yeah, I don't know. Every time we talk about these things that are more consumery than enterprisey products, we still end up coming back to the fact that like tons of consumer-ish sort of like, I mean, routers, particularly like
Hmm.
Soho, small office home office routers, end up being present or uh, connected to enterprise environments. And so the idea that a non-enterprisey seeming device somehow is not with a backdoor like this is somehow not a risk to enterprises is
Yeah,
kind of
because it's
coke.
I think a lot of it could be skunkworks IT. Like, oh, I don't want to go beg the storage team because that I have to file a ticket and that could take a week.
Hmm.
And I really need some storage for my project. And I have a corporate credit card and I have Amazon. So I'll go buy a QNAP device and I'll plug it in. And then I need remote access to it. So I think on the home side, a lot of folks are deploying these QNAP devices and then exposing them to the internet because like, oh, I got files. I need access to my files. How do I get access to my files? Oh, I'll just put it on the internet so that I can get to it, not realizing that so can the entire internet. And I really do believe it's sometimes not realizing what they're doing in terms of exposure, right?
Hmm.
Um, because there is a certain level of technical sophistication to implement your own VPN in order to do that. So then these devices end up on the internet and they have poor code quality, just like every other, embedded type system, or similar to all the other embedded type systems we've talked about on the show. And attackers go, oh, this could be a nice little botnet, right? And way into some networks. And maybe we'll get some enterprise networks in there too. So,
Yeah, 100%. And it's also worth noting that it targets a range of vendors too. The Polar Edge, they've had a couple articles about Polar Edge, I feel in the
they have, yeah.
last.
It's not the first time they've talked about it. I think this is
No.
yeah,
It looks like they did some private research. This post that we're talking about right now was originally distributed as a private research just to their customers and has since been made public, but they've written about it before and talked about
well,
ASUS and
also, yeah,
Synology and Cisco being targeted by
yeah.
this Polar Edge botnet malware.
Yeah, yeah. So there were. You're right. I think it did target some Cisco small business devices. So that could
Hmm.
also be the target of smaller businesses. They're not going to go buy enterprise level grade storage, from Dell EMC, as an example. They're going to go buy the Synology QNAPs of the world. I've been guilty of that. I've bought the smaller NAS network based, or I guess that's in the name, similar to your analogy earlier, right? Network attached storage. So it's not a network NAS. It literally stands for network attached storage. But you need a NAS device on your network, and you're like, well, I can't afford to go spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on it, but for $1,000 or less, I can go buy one of these devices, plug it in. I've got a couple of terabytes hanging on my network now, and that's why they've grown in popularity over the years. But they've been plagued with security issues for some time, and some are better than others.
Yeah. Seeing in one of the articles about this, that this Polar Edge offering something that's been marketed as a malware as a service operation, and then also has been connected with the Luma stealer. Been reading a lot about info stealers. I feel like that's going to
Yes.
be the big topic in all of the end of year, 2025 H2 reports is info stealers, because that's
Yeah.
just like the new
I
That's the
interviewed someone that did a lot is doing a lot of research into info stealers, and it's really an attacker progression kind of thing.
yeah.
How does an attacker monetize? Well, if I can break into a system, there's a number of things I can do to monetize it. I can do ransomware, very noisy, most of the time a one and done kind of thing, although it does come back. Or I can persist like nation state threat actors, like the F5 one, persist, and it's kind of for a different purpose, maybe not monetarily focused. Or if I get on a system, why can't I just steal all the information that's there and then parse through it and then use that to monetize? Then I can sell it.
Mhm.
Maybe I can use it to get access to other things to steal more things. Then I can go sell the data that I'm stealing. And that seems to be increasing in popularity.
Yeah, yeah, totally. It's the new meta. We talk about, yeah, the shifting attacker behaviors, and this one is definitely it's the business model, the like as a service model. There was ransomware as a service. There's now there's malware and botnet as a service. I think a lot of these info stealers are still just getting initially delivered via basically phishing emails. It's like very classic initial vector, but then the actual behavior of it and the business model behind it is evolving and being optimized. I see it as like, have you ever seen that graphic of where I'm going to do a sports analogy. Hold on to your hats,
Mm.
folks. Of where NBA shots are sunk from over the years. If you look back in like the 80s and 90s, people were shooting from all over the place. There's a lot from the free throw line. It's like kind of all over the map, very scattered. And as you get up to today, it's like almost 100% of shots are from right behind the 3 point line.
Mm.
And it's like the whole sport has become optimized around taking these 3 point shots. And it's like that's what it's like this refinement of technique that's happening where it's like that's just what works. That's how you
Yeah.
win games
Right.
most effectively, I guess. And that's totally what cyber attackers are looking for and are doing right now is figuring out like where's the 3 point line in cyber attacks where
Yep.
you can shoot, you can hit the shots and just rack up points, and you it's it's like, yeah, phishing email to info stealer, harvest the information,
There you go.
sell it online.
Hmm.
That's the 3 pointer. And there's always a new Steph Curry coming up of
Right.
like
Right.
combo of the info stealer software and then like the distribution network for it.
Did you see the article on creating two-faced Rust binary on Linux?
Yeah, I saw.
This
Yep.
this appears to me to be a really awesome, interesting technique, right? And it was written up by Synactive, and
Hmm.
I think that it's one of those things where someone does the research, publishes it, maybe they do a conference talk, and then it takes some time to be adopted into different types of malware. This one was pretty crafty, right? It's basically including cryptographic payloads inside of a binary that only execute on a particular system,
Yeah.
right? And it'll decide that execution path based on deriving keys from the host uniqueness. So it's encrypting it differently for each binary. So basically, the binary is encrypted for each system, and then it has obfuscation to make it really hard for folks like us to do runtime anti-debug, and it chains multiple loaders to even further confuse like just how it's running and executing code. So they have a complete write-up. I thought it was kind of interesting.
It's sort of a next phase, a next evolution in like the polymorphic malware narrative, where it's
Hmm.
like there's early days there was like, oh, this thing changes a little bit of its code or like changes the strings that it renames files as or whatever, so that it becomes harder to detect. This thing has so many different factors that it tweaks based on the specific host, specifically to make it really hard to detect, and also to make it operate on the type of host that it wants to operate on.
Right. Yeah, and
uh,
it's hard to you gotta, as a defender or researcher for defense, you got to unpack this, and then you have to be creative. How are we going to detect this?
yeah.
Does our existing methods detect it? Like we do look for encrypted payloads inside of binaries, which can be suspicious, but can also throw some false positives. As there is sometimes a legitimate, I forget the use case, but I remember hearing there are like legitimate binaries that do have that. So it's not the greatest test. So then how do you advance to detect techniques like this, right? Requires a lot of research, and now we're playing catch up basically.
Yeah. But boy, I'm gonna start asking questions that are gonna get me a few steps past my level of technical acumen in this area. But I'm curious from your perspective how would this kind of thing apply in a like firmware binaries type of scenario? And part of why I'm asking is because I was looking at some of our own, firmware
Mm-hmm.
analysis and unpacking that we do at Eclipsium, and something that I didn't realize about firmware is the wide range in the number of binaries that can be inside of a single like firmware package. It
Yes,
can be
yes.
anywhere from like one or two to thousands or tens of thousands, depending on the system. And each one of those is hypothetically, correct me if I'm wrong, but each one of those is hypothetically like executable, or it contains configuration information that affects how other things execute. And so it's this, to me, that seems like a really nice haystack to hide a needle in
Yeah.
of something like this. I don't know how exactly you would get it in there, but
Well,
you
you
know,
can repack firmware to a certain extent, and that varies. But you think of firmware as everything bundled into one, right? So it's your bootloader, your kernel, and all your file system all bundled into one. And when you build a regular desktop or PC, right, those are typically like different components. They come from various sources that and the installer will take care of a lot of that for you, but it's installing everything individually. With firmware, you have one file, and then when you unpack that file, everything is in there, right?
mhm.
And so that's how we can put binaries in there. There are a lot of different binaries and different firmware distributions, and that's why I believe that firmware signature validation is so important. It's an attack vector that unfortunately is all too common, as I'm finding in security research, that not everyone, I mean, this is nothing new or novel, but not everyone validates the firmware signatures before they install them, right? And this is not just an MD5 hash necessarily. I mean, it could be, and that does provide a certain degree, whether that's done automatically or whether that's left up to the user to go. When you install this firmware, it should have this hash, and if that's more for like, did the firmware get corrupt in transit, rather than actually cryptographically verifying, is this firmware intended to run on here or has it been backdoored? But unfortunately, there's so many devices that just don't have that process to cryptographically verify the firmware. And that affords the luxury of putting binaries in there, binaries such as two-phase Rust binaries that are very crafty at hiding themselves and having unique signatures.
Yeah. If you suspected that there was a two-faced binary inside of a firmware package that had 10,000 plus different different
Yeah,
binaries in it, how
like
are
it's hard. I
you?
mean, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
talk to our product team because that's what they do, right? The engineering team, that's what they do. And it's difficult. Integrity checking, which is one of my favorite things that we do, helps with this, right? And going back to like F5 as an example, perhaps F5 doesn't include Go binaries in their distribution, but if a Go binary appears, that could be suspicious, right? So you can do simple things like that when it comes to firmware, because it is such a tightly controlled environment, and you should know from the firmware image what should be in there and what shouldn't. But there's a lot of nuances in art and science in that as well, because there's things that happen when that firmware is installed that changes the behavior and signature potentially of things. So
Yeah. It's a tangled web.
yeah, for sure. Oh, I want to talk a little bit about authentication bypass. Has been on my mind lately.
Yep.
It's a very dangerous attack vector when I think about it, right? Because I'm working on like my favorite authentication bypass vulnerabilities, different ways to discover them. And this Dell Storage Manager one came up, and it gets a CVSS score of 9.8, and it's a goal. Why? Because an attacker that can bypass authentication completely has access to all the functionalities of that device, independent of other vulnerabilities that might be present. But what I see is this, the analogy that we used to use for our networks, probably still do, the hard and crunchy outside and the soft and chewy center. So many of these devices rely on that authentication to protect from exploitation of vulnerabilities that might require authentication, right? You see a much lower CVSS score for a vulnerability that requires authentication versus one that does not. However, those vulnerabilities that have a lower score are just one vulnerability away from via authentication bypass. So if you can bypass authentication, now all those like mediums or whatever, those are all in play. And there's a plethora of them, right? And now, like, if your kernel version is out of date, that's in play now. So authentication bypass is something to pay attention to. I think that when new vulnerabilities come out, if they're in that class, it's something to pay attention to. So this was CVE 2025 43994. Oh no, I'm sorry. Missing
I think it's
authentication.
two.
So
It's
yeah, sorry.
43994 and 43995.
Five, yeah, 43995 is missing authentication for critical functions. And that's the hard part is when you're doing the web application for the device that's your management interface, and you in that application, it's deciding what URL endpoints, if you will, are require authentication and which ones do not. So there might be some that don't require authentication. There might be some that's hidden somewhere in the code that you don't know about until you go look at that code and go, oh, I think I can get to this because the way they're doing authentication, they're not authenticating that endpoint. So just some tips on discovery, and also kind of the heightened severity that these authentication bypasses carry with them. So
That's a super interesting concept, that one new authentication bypass vulnerability coming out can sort of unlock a new risk
right,
level for, or even unlock like exploitability at all for a bunch of previously disclosed CVEs. We've been talking a little
right.
bit recently internally about how many new CVEs get created, and just like the huge the hockey stick growth in the number of
It's
CVEs
massive,
getting
dude.
created. It's easily going to pass 40,000, probably 50,000 or more in 2025, back from, only 20,000 a couple years
Yeah,
ago. And so it's only going up. And the number of them, if you think about, okay, each one of those has a risk score, right? It's got a CVSS score, and many of those were assigned based on current knowledge about whether there was auth bypass or authentication sitting in front of it. And I doubt that those get retroactively adjusted
right.
when so if an auth bypass comes out that's like, oh, if this had already been out at the time that these hundreds of vulns were disclosed, they would have been dubbed highly severe. They would
Yeah,
have
it's
had
interesting.
high
There's nothing
severity.
that really, other than doing it manually, there's nothing that really correlates it. And it's
No.
interesting. I'm working on a Python script to enumerate vulnerabilities from the NVD catalog, and I can
Dude, I
search
want that
back.
so bad.
Yeah,
I,
I'll share it, but I'm still working on it. But so I can specify a time frame. So I'm like, search for this term in the past month, but then I'm like, show me if there are any exploits for those vulnerabilities, and that requires a call that I built an option. I vibe coded it, and I haven't gone through the code manually yet, which is why I'm still working on it. But like, go out to GitHub and use the GitHub API to see if there's any exploits for that CVE, and it was unreliable. And I'm like, well, that's weird. Like, why is it unreliable? And a few more prompts later, Claude was like, oh, it is returning a rate limiting from the API in GitHub. Because to your point, there's so many CVEs.
so
Even
many.
in a shortened time frame, in a shortened search, I was coming up against the GitHub API rate limiting because it had to do so many queries because there were so many CVEs.
Yeah.
And the Linux kernel ones there's a plethora of them. And I noticed that too, because to back up your point, because if I do like string searches,
Mm-hmm.
I'll get Linux kernel CVEs associated with my search term, which had nothing to do with Linux kernel CVEs, but it's because a string was in that Linux kernel one, and in the Linux kernel one they plop source code or a bunch of text in there, which is hitting keyword searches on CVEs.
Hmm.
If you search for checkpoint, for example, but there's like a function call in the Linux kernel CVE that was fixed that had the word checkpoint in it, and therefore it's false positive. So
Hmm.
for my search, but also speaks to Linux kernel was in WordPress are like the number 1 and 2 issuers of CVEs.
That's, yeah, man. I was trying to build a graph the other day to show the difference in growth rate between the CISA known exploited vulnerabilities, the KEV that
Mm-hmm.
we all know and love and mention on every episode of this podcast, um, and just the number of CVEs and the number of like the KEV doesn't, well, particularly now that on CISA.com, there's a little note that's like, by the way, this website is not being actively maintained
Right.
because of current, gestures wildly at everything. But the Kev only grows by maybe a couple hundred vulnerabilities every year that are known to
Right.
be actively exploited. Um, and a tiny percentage of those that are known to be exploited in ransomware campaigns, which is like for the amount of like airtime that ransomware takes up, it all depends on a relatively low number of vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm.
um, but it's like, okay, so there's this huge number of CVEs getting added, getting, created, but relatively few getting added to the known exploited vulnerabilities. I got to imagine at some point that, like with the authentication bypass thing, there's going to be some unlock in, AI vibe coding of exploits for vulnerabilities that's just going to look back, someone's going to write a script that's going to look back at all of those vulnerabilities are not known exploited yet and figure out how to exploit them very quickly and automatically and spray and pray and do them. And there's going to be a whole bunch of those that go from not being actively exploited to being actively exploited pretty quickly.
Right.
And it kind of feels like there's just yeah, a crack in the dam that's waiting to break and flood us all with these random, like seemingly low risk, or they're labeled as low risk, but their risk went up because,
Mm-hmm.
there's like a golden path through there where it's like an auth bypass vulnerability raises the risk level of a bunch of those. And then some sort of AI vibe coding advance creates exploits for a bunch of those all at once. And it's
Yeah.
going to be, it's going to be a wild ride when that
Well,
happens.
the last one we had on here was the Cisco SNMP vulnerability that we wrote about,
Yeah.
2025-2352. And I think we predicted this. We saw this come out. Was this added to the Kev? Did we
It
see?
has been now. It was,
It has been now
yeah,
probably as a result of, I think, the Trend Micro research. Was it
yeah,
Trend that did the research on this one? I think
yeah, it was.
it was. Yeah.
Yeah. I
And
think the first thing I saw about it was just an article that was like, by the way, 2 million devices are vulnerable to this SNMP thing, but it wasn't known to be exploited.
right.
It's like, well, that's coming.
Yeah. Then I started seeing articles that were like, "Hey, it's being exploited." I'm like, "Really?" I'm like, "Who has the details on that?" And I trace it back to the Trend Micro article, and I'm like, "Oh, so Trend Micro released some IOCs, really just hashes of some of the files, but some of those file hashes were zip files, so we don't have the hashes of what's inside the zip file.
Hmm.
However, the toolkit or malware that they're using, I don't have all my notes on it, but it's in very detailed. The techniques included fileless persistence, ARP spoofing, traffic manipulation, full log erasure, and creating backdoor. And I think their backdoor password was disco, and so this operation is dubbed zero disco.
Hmm.
And so if you want to read about it, if you search in Google or your favorite LLM for zero disco, it'll give you some resources on that. But yeah, the capabilities they had in this malware was pretty staggering when I started reading about it. Now I have been unable to find any public samples of this malware. It'd be nice if we could share those samples. That'd be awesome because with the samples, then we can do deeper detection. So
Yeah, they've got like little screenshots of the malicious SNMP packet and various things, but yeah, I haven't seen any. There hasn't been a full release of any samples yet that I've seen around.
yeah,
I
me
think you're
neither,
more
which is
tuned
kind
into
of,
that than
yeah,
I am, but
yeah, it's kind of disappointing. But yeah, some amazing techniques what they were doing in this. You got to read the article. It was pretty good. Do we have a link to? Yeah, I'll put a link to the article in the show notes.
yeah. Which man, this raises another sort of axe that I have to grind about old. Like if you look at the SysACAV, we've talked about this. Look at this SysACAV, the lag time from when a vulnerability was disclosed, the date that's in the CVE
Hmm.
designation to when it got added to the KEV. Some of them are short and some of them are many years. And I think there is it is under recognized or under accounted for. It's not the amount of risk that is represented by old vulnerabilities is not priced in enough
Hmm.
by organizations because there's stuff on there from like 2008 that got
Right.
only got added to the KEV within the past couple of years. And it's that thing where it's like these old vulnerabilities are just sitting there. They didn't go away. Like maybe everybody has patched or updated their stuff, but I mean, not everybody.
Yeah, right.
And
Those that have, but from if you go back to 2008, though, those that were going to patch have patched.
yeah, exactly.
Right? That's kind of the theory we have, is that what's left out there are people that just aren't going to patch, right?
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
Yeah, and if those vulnerabilities all of a sudden become actively exploited or
Yeah, then
exploitable,
you're in,
some sort of little bottleneck to exploiting them programmatically gets opened
right.
up, like the auth bypass thing,
And
or
there
just someone develops an exploit.
in vulnerability management, there was something to be said for how old the vulnerabilities are that are being discovered.
Yeah.
Because if it's missing a patch from 2008, it's likely also missing all the patches that came out after 2008.
Um,
And now, not only do you have a ripe attack surface for a threat actor, but now you've got a lot of work to do. You've got a lot of technical debt.
yeah.
So, and if the patches are old enough to go back to your example of 2008, maybe that device isn't even supported anymore in its end of life,
Yeah.
right? And even
Highly
if it's
likely.
not, even if it's still supported, if you're that far behind, getting up to the latest is so much more work than if you were to break that work up into smaller chunks. I use the DevOps analogy all the time with respects to vulnerability and patch management, is that you have to break up into smaller chunks and do the work as you go. Otherwise, you're going to incur too much technical debt, and then you're not going to be able to catch up easily, and you're not going to be resilient. So,
Yeah. One thing I found when I was more working in the area of industrial control systems and operational technology is that there's a lot of environments out there that historically were supposed to be air gapped or they
yeah,
considered themselves air gapped. And the whole concept of air gapped systems has been super eroded over the past like 2 decades or so, to where it used to be, yeah, systems could be pretty much air gapped and not have any external network connectivity. And then gradually vendors who were providing critical operational systems were like, we have to, you can't buy this product that goes in your manufacturing line or your offshore oil rig or
hmm,
whatever. You're not allowed to buy it without buying a support contract from us because we're the ones that know how to maintain it. And if it goes out on you, stops working or whatever, you're
hmm,
not going to be able to fix it. And we're not going to take the liability for that. So you have to buy a support contract. And in order for us to be able to execute on that support contract, you have to allow us remote access because you can't chopper us out to the offshore oil rig every time you needed
right,
update. And so there have gradually snuck in all this network connectivity and these back doors,
hmm,
manufacturer, vendor, service provider back doors that mean that environments that used to be required to be air gapped or considered to be air gapped just aren't anymore.
hmm,
And they would use that as an excuse or as a reason to not update stuff. They're like, yeah, it's okay to keep this thing around. It would be too costly and too difficult to update off this Windows 7 box that we have controlling this critical machinery. And
right.
it's air gapped. You can't, and it's just not anymore. And so I feel like, yeah, at that sort of age of exploits, there's a whole really critical infrastructure attack surface that's at significant risk that still has that kind of air gap mindset, even though it's not true in practicality anymore.
For sure. Well, Chase, thank you very much for coming on the show today. Thank you, everyone, for listening, watching this edition of Eclipsium's Below the Surface. We'll see you next time.